Comanche Station was not just Budd Boetticher's most melancholic Western. It was a $600,000 aesthetic gamble built on a foundation of industrial exhaustion, assembled by a director who was already mentally checking out of the genre he had perfected, held together by a star who was visibly aging out of the physical demands the script required, and haunted by the ghost of a screenplay that the genre's defining writer had publicly dismissed as a creative dead end. We are digging into the wreckage of Comanche Station with 15 secrets the studio tried to bury. Secrets locked inside union grievances, censorship files, and the kind of production memoirs that only make sense once you understand that the minimalist masterpiece the critics later celebrated was actually the result of a production running on fumes, budget cuts, and discarded footage from other movies. The film's title, Comanche Station, serves a functional, geographical purpose that feels almost deliberately anonymous compared to the evocative titles of the earlier Ranown cycle. But the production history reveals that the project was originally registered under a different name, The Captive. The title was rejected by Columbia's marketing department for what internal memos described as softness, a refusal to promise the kind of visceral action that the drive in market demanded. But the insulting reason for the rejection ran deeper than marketing logic. The original title implied a focus on the woman, Nancy Lowe, and her trauma, a subject the studio was actively trying to sanitize to satisfy the production code. By changing the title to Comanche Station, the studio shifted the focus away from the uncomfortable human reality of a woman held captive for 5 years and toward a generic locale, a waypoint in the landscape. The title change was the first act of erasure in a film full of them, erasing the woman's trauma to sell a simpler, cleaner narrative of rescue. Budd Boetticher arrived at Comanche Station carrying a burden that the film's tight runtime conceals. He was a man trapped in a genre he had mastered but no longer loved. By 1960, Boetticher was desperate to escape the B-Western ghetto and prove himself as a serious auteur, specifically through his long gestating bullfighting project. But the machinery of the industry had other plans. Comanche Station was not a passion project. It was a professional obligation, a survive-or-die moment required to keep his name viable in the trade papers. He took the job to fund his stalled dreams of prestige drama, and the set reflected it. The invisible list of crew grievances mentions a director who was volatile and impatient, treating the Alabama Hills not as a canvas for poetry, but as a factory floor. He was directing on autopilot, a craftsman fulfilling a contract rather than an artist chasing a vision. The melancholic tone that critics would later praise as existential was, in reality, the byproduct of a director who was already bored with the Western and was simply going through the motions to get to the end of his contractual obligations. The absence of Burt Kennedy from the credits of Comanche Station is the most glaring invisible fact of the production. Kennedy had written the previous Scott Boetticher collaborations, defining the laconic, morally complex voice of the series. But for this final entry, the screenplay was handed to Charles Lang. The insulting reason for the shift was financial and creative fatigue. Kennedy read the early treatment, essentially a rehash of The Searcher's dynamics, and famously dismissed the project. He told Boetticher that the script was a mediocre photocopy of his earlier work, stripped of the emotional complexity that had made 7 Men from Now a classic. Kennedy's refusal to participate was not a scheduling conflict. It was a creative divorce. He saw the film as a dead end, a lazy attempt to recycle genre mechanics without the moral weight to justify them. The film was made without the architect of its own soul, and the resulting script, while functional, lacks the sharp dialogue and psychological depth of Kennedy's contributions, leaving the actors to fill in the blanks with sheer presence. The casting of the complex outlaw Ben Lane fell to Claude Akins, who delivered a performance of charismatic menace that perfectly mirrored Randolph Scott's weary stoicism. But the sliding doors reality of the production is that Akins was not the first choice. Boetticher had aggressively campaigned for Lee Marvin, an actor whose volatile intensity would have pushed the film into a darker, more psychological territory. The rejection of Marvin came down to a single insulting reason: money. Producer Harry Joe Brown, acting as the guardian of the film's shoestring budget, refused to pay Marvin's asking price, which was a mere $5,000 above the allocated budget for the role. Marvin, insulted by the lowball offer, a figure that barely registered above union scale for a lead actor, walked away from the project. The studio's frugality forced Akins into the role. While Akins is excellent, the ghost of Marvin's potential performance hangs over the film. Had Marvin accepted, the final confrontation would have been a collision of titans rather than a competent genre standoff, and the film might have escaped its B-movie limitations. Randolph Scott was 62 years old when he rode into the Alabama hills for Comanche Station, and the physical toll of a lifetime of westerns was etched into his face. The script required him to be a man of action, riding hard and fighting in the dust, but the reality of the production was far grimmer. The dark fact hidden in the daily call sheets is the refusal of the production to hire a quality stunt double for the wider action shots. The budget was so tight that Boetticher pressured Scott to perform his own stunts to save the time and expense of resetting cameras for a double. Scott, a professional to the core, complied, but the outtakes tell a different story than the final cut. Crew members reported the star grimacing in pain after every fall, his body battered by the uncompromising terrain. The exhaustion we see on screen, the deep lines around his eyes, the heavy way he dismounts, was not acting. It was the physical reality of a star who was pushing his body past its limits because the studio was too cheap to protect him. Nancy Gates played the captive woman, Nancy Lowe, a role that required her to embody the trauma of 5 years of captivity. But the dark fact of her performance is found in the wardrobe and makeup decisions, which were dictated not by the script's logic, but by the studio's fear of ugliness. Despite playing a woman who had lived in a Comanche camp for half a decade, Gates appeared on screen in pristine, perfectly fitted clothing with flawless hair and makeup. The reason given by the front office was insulting. They believed that if she looked too authentic, dirty, scarred, or disheveled, the drive-in audiences would reject her as unattractive. This constant interference undermined the realism Boetticher was trying to achieve. Gates was forced to act against the logic of her character, maintaining a glamorous facade while mouthing lines about trauma and abuse. The cognitive dissonance on set was palpable. The director wanted grit, the studio wanted glamour, and the actress was caught in the middle, forced to look like a magazine model in a scenario that demanded raw honesty. The Alabama hills of California provided the stunning, jagged backdrop for the film, but the environment turned hostile during the 2-week shoot. The invisible list of grievances filed by the crew documents a heat wave that sent temperatures soaring past 100 degrees, causing cameras to jam and film stock to warp. But the real problem was the dust. The location was chosen because it was cheap, no rental fees for public land, but the dry lake bed where the station was built turned into a dust bowl. The crew was breathing in silica dust for 14 hours a day. Local medical records from the period show a spike in respiratory issues among the film crew, yet the production offered no masks or protective gear. The sweatshop mentality meant that the crew was expected to work through the heat without complaint. When the camera assistant fainted from heat stroke, Boetticher famously quipped that they should throw some water on him and keep rolling. It was a sentiment that summed up the production's disregard for the human cost of their schedule. The sweeping vistas of Native American riders that open the film are breathtaking, but they are also a lie. The informed eye will notice that the color grading and grain of these shots do not match the rest of the film. Investigative analysis confirms that these sequences were lifted from the Columbia archives, taken from the 1956 film Comanche, directed by George Sherman. Boetticher was forced to use this footage to pad the runtime because the script was too short. The original cut ran barely 70 minutes, too short for a feature release. Rather than shooting new scenes, which would cost money, the editor was instructed to splice in action shots from a 4-year-old movie. This lazy patchwork is visible in the cuts. The lighting does not match. The horses change color between shots, and the Comanche actors in the stock footage are clearly different from the extras on set. It was a deception, a sleight of hand hoping the audience would not notice that the action they were watching was a rerun. The music for Comanche Station is credited to Heinz Rohmheld, but he did not compose it. Due to the slashed budget, Rohmheld was told to compile a score. This is industry code for patching together a soundtrack from the studio's library of unused cues. The dramatic brass hits and romantic strings heard in Comanche Station are actually recycled tracks from other Columbia films, including The 3:10 to Yuma and The Gunfight at the OK Corral. This practice cheated the original composers out of residuals and provided the film with a generic, one-size-fits-all emotional landscape. The music feels intrusive because it was written for different scenes with different pacing. The dark fact here is the fraudulent credit. Rohmheld collected a paycheck for essentially acting as a disc jockey, stitching together a Frankenstein soundtrack that robbed the film of a unique auditory identity. The thematic censorship imposed by the Hays Code represents the film's greatest loss of artistic integrity. The Production Code Administration files for Comanche Station reveal a fierce battle over the subplot involving the captive woman. The original script heavily implied that the woman had been sexually assaulted by her captors. This was the source of her trauma and her fear of returning to her husband. The Production Code Administration, however, demanded that all references to miscegenation or sexual violation be removed. They forced the writers to change the dialogue to suggest she was merely held for ransom. This sanitization stripped the film of its stakes. If she was not violated, why was she so terrified? The logic collapsed under the censorship. The dark fact is that Boetticher filmed the grittier, implied version, but was forced to dub over the dialogue in post-production to satisfy the moral watchdogs, creating an awkward disconnect between the actors' pained faces and the sanitized words coming out of their mouths. The film portrays the Comanche as silent, faceless antagonists, a trope that was already outdated by 1960. But the deeper investigative truth lies in the casting. The Comanche Raiders were played by a mix of Latino extras and local ranch hands, paid a flat daily rate of $15, significantly less than the white stunt performers. Even more egregious, the production did not hire a dialogue coach for the Native American lines. The actors were told to speak gibberish or Hollywood Indian sounds, assuming the audience would not know the difference. However, linguistic analysis of the audio reveals that some of the actors were actually insulting the director and crew in Spanish, knowing that no one on the production team would understand them. They were cursing the low pay and the dust, hiding their grievances in plain sight within the film's audio track. It is a secret rebellion recorded forever on the soundtrack, a middle finger to a production that treated them as expendable props. The final insult to the film's legacy occurred in the editing room, where the high-stakes bridges of the narrative were severed to ensure a faster pace. Boetticher's original cut featured a longer, more contemplative ending, where Scott's character Jefferson Cody rides away not as a victor, but as a tragic figure who has traded one loneliness for another. The studio executives, fearing the audience wanted a happier ending, demanded a quicker cut to black after the final gunfight. They removed a crucial 90-second sequence of Scott looking back at the couple he saved, realizing he has no place in their domestic world. This removal stripped the film of its existential weight, turning a tragedy into a standard action resolution. The footage, which contained Scott's most nuanced acting work, was discarded and is believed to be lost or destroyed. The film we see today is a compromised version, a shell of the darker, more personal vision Boetticher intended. The tension between the producer, Harry Joe Brown, and the director, Budd Boetticher, finally reached a breaking point during the post-production of the film. The career anchor for Boetticher was not just the grind of the shoot, it was the humiliation of the final cut. Brown, who controlled the final edit, recut the film behind Boetticher's back to tighten the runtime for double feature releases. When Boetticher saw the final version, he was livid. He realized that the subtle pacing he had fought for had been butchered. The argument that ensued in the Columbia screening room was legendary. Boetticher accused Brown of destroying the film's soul for the sake of 5 minutes of runtime. Brown's response was cold. "We sell tickets, not souls." That moment marked the definitive end of the Ranown cycle. It was not a mutual parting of ways. It was a violent severance. Boetticher walked away from the series he created because he refused to be treated as a mere technician. Despite the turmoil, the sliding doors moment that haunts the film's legacy is the what if regarding Randolph Scott's retirement. Scott was already a wealthy man, having invested his earnings wisely in real estate and oil. He did not need to make Comanche Station. He did it out of loyalty to the crew and Boetticher. However, the production was so miserable and the final product so compromised by studio interference that it solidified Scott's decision to retire from acting entirely. If Comanche Station had been a smoother, more respectful production, Scott might have continued acting into the mid-60s, potentially collaborating with the rising generation of revisionist Western directors like Sam Peckinpah. Instead, the insulting treatment he received, the low budget, the rush schedule, the lack of creative input, convinced him to hang up his spurs. We lost a decade of Randolph Scott performances because a studio wanted to save a few $1,000s on location fees and overtime. When Comanche Station was released, the critical reception was lukewarm at best, and often hostile. The critics of the era, blinded by the film's B-movie pedigree, dismissed it as programmer filler. The most scathing review came from the New York Times, which called the film a routine Western, indistinguishable from the dozens of others cluttering the marketplace. Howard Thompson, writing for the same paper, lamented that Scott deserves better than this familiar terrain. The majority of critics measured the film against the kinetic intensity of the era's epics, finding it slow and cheap. They were measuring the container rather than the contents. They reviewed the genre. They did not review the argument the genre was being used to dismantle. The argument that a man who has lost everything has nothing left except the purpose that grief has given him. The 6 decades since Comanche Station quietly closed its run have produced, in the accumulated body of critical writing about the Western, a retrospective recognition that the film deserves, not as a masterpiece of the genre, but as a specific and honest document of what the psychological Western could do when it was stripped to its absolute bones. The modern reevaluation has recognized that the emptiness of the film, once criticized as a lack of plot, is actually a deliberate reflection of the protagonist's hollowed-out soul. It is now taught in film schools as a masterclass in economic storytelling, where the geography of the landscape mirrors the internal isolation of the characters. It has transcended its sweatshop origins to become a testament to the power of visual poetry, proving that even a film made under duress, with stolen footage and a compromised script, can capture lightning in a bottle when the star's weary eyes align perfectly with the director's fading ambition. The film that survived is imperfect in the way that productions assembled from exhaustion are always imperfect. The wrong score compiled from other films' leftovers, the wrong title chosen to mask the story's true pain, the wrong edit imposed by a producer counting minutes, and the moral argument buried under stock footage that the director did not even shoot. Budd Boetticher had defined the Ranown cycle with 7 films of lean, moral precision, and walked away from the final one, feeling he had been edited out of his own legacy. Burt Kennedy had written the definitive voice of the Western hero, and refused to write this one, calling it a photocopy of his own soul. Randolph Scott had built his career on the physical grace of the cowboy and was forced to perform his own stunts at 62 because the studio refused to pay for a double, leaving the screen heavy with the weight of his impending retirement. But here's the question that Comanche Station leaves embedded in Jefferson Cody's final ride into the void. In that moment when the man who has traded goods for a captive woman realizes that he has no place in the civilization he has restored, if the most poignant argument about loneliness in the Western genre, the argument that the hero who saves others cannot save himself, was delivered in 1960 by a film that critics dismissed as routine, directed by a man who wanted to be anywhere else, starring an actor whose body was failing him, assembled from the recycled parts of older, better movies, then what does that tell you about how we value art based on its budget rather than its truth? And if the answer is that the most honest truths are often hidden in the cheapest productions because those are the only ones where the studio stops caring enough to interfere with the soul of the thing, which B movies playing on obscure channels right now are carrying the secrets that the prestige films were too polished to contain? Leave that in the comments. If this investigation changed how you see Comanche Station, leave a like, because there are 1,000 films with buried secrets that deserve the same forensic attention, and the algorithm needs to know this kind of digging matters.